Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Early Muslim Expansion Part 4 by Kings and Generals. So yes, this is our last reaction to the first almost 2-hour-long video in Kings and Generals Early Muslim Expansion series. Don't worry, we'll be continuing the series following this reaction. I'll be watching the rest of it. I'm excited to continue. But in terms of this video, where we left off last time was with the Roman defeat at the Battle of the Yarmouk. It ended up being a really significant Muslim victory, and it really was a sign of things to come. So presumably we'll start off with some of the aftermath of that in this video. If you guys end up enjoying this reaction, I'd appreciate it if you check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
At this point in this story, we have to leave the Syrian front, as things have started heating up in Iraq. In the aftermath of the...
Okay, back to the Sassanids. That's where we began this series, watching Muslim victories over the Persians. Then we moved to the Byzantines, and now back to the Sassanid Empire.
Decisive victory at the Battle of the Bridge, Persian forces made no move to capitalize on it, either hoping that the attack was over or being preoccupied with other matters. This gave Caliph Umar time to come up with a response. Lacking an immediate source of manpower, the pragmatic Rashidun Caliph raised another army from the previously untapped tribes who rebelled against the Caliphate during the Ridda Wars, including the Banu Tamim and Banu Jadila. These warriors, supplemented by additional contingents mustered by Umar, were gathered and sent north, but problems were still present. Quarreling between many of the tribal chiefs prompted the Caliph to appoint a trusted paragon to supreme command, who was absolutely beyond reproach. After being talked out of leading the army himself, Umar's commander would be Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, the 7th person to embrace Islam and a companion of...
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's pretty prestigious. He was really early to the party.
the Prophet. The presence of such a respected general united the army in spirit. Additionally, many more warriors joined themselves to Sa'd's invasion force as it marched north up the Medina-Hira road in May of 636.
We're seeing Umar being active in his response again. This is pretty typical of him. Ever since he took over from Abu Bakr, he has definitely been trying to reform things, change things, make the caliphate function more effectively, at least in his eyes. And we're seeing a pretty rapid response to Sassanid victories, though I'd say fairly minor Sassanid victories that they have failed to take advantage of. Now, of course, with such a massive empire, you know, the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, it's very hard to take advantage over victories, particularly if you don't think it'll come back to bite you. I mean, Yazdegerd has got a million different things to deal with across his vast empire. He may just not have the resources, time, attention, or think it's even worth it to advance further into the desert to fight more Muslim raiders. Of course, it appears that's going to come back to bite him, but I guess we'll see how this conflict is going to go.
By the time it reached the Euphrates region for a second time, the Muslim army was probably the most formidable Persia had faced so far. Unfortunately for Sa'd, resistance to his advance was soon in coming. The best Sassanid general, Rostam, who basically ruled the court of the 12-year-old Shah Yazdegerd III, wanted to fight smaller battles to minimize risk. But that decision was unpopular with the nobles and commoners alike, as the Battle of the Bridge probably made the empire complacent. Therefore, the general departed the Persian capital at...
It's unfortunate because Rostam is probably right. You know, coming from his position, you know, at the head of this massive empire, when you fight battles, you generally want to be more defensive. The goal of these massive empires like the Sassanids or the Romans is generally to avoid losing as many men as possible. You know, they want to hide in their walled cities, act defensively, avoid losing large numbers of men because, you know, they need as many people as they can get to garrison their empire. So Rostam is probably right that acting more defensively and fighting smaller battles would be more effective, but unfortunately he has not been able to pursue that course of action.
It's the head of a massive imperial force, beelining straight for the Muslims encamped near Alcadisia. The two opposing armies finally caught sight of one another across the span of the Al-Atiq Canal, about 30 miles east of Hira. After an exhausting march in the midst of Iraq's blistering summer, Rostam ordered his men to take up positions and encamp across from Sa'd's army. Rather than immediately mounting an assault across the canal, the bulk of both armies remained on their own side of the waterway for several months, with the peace only punctuated by small scouting missions and raids. Rostam probably knew that the previous Islamic army had been defeated during a botched river crossing, and was therefore content to wait and receive Sa'd's attack, hoping it would happen again. The Muslims, meanwhile, were fighting a two-front war, so keeping the Mesopotamian army passive for the time being was prudent.
I mean, it's true. We saw in the last reaction that the Sassanids and the Romans, who were long-standing enemies themselves, off again, on again warfare between those two empires, had decided that it was worth it to ally against this Muslim threat, which was dangerous to both of them. And so, the Caliphate is facing, like they said, a war on two fronts, and so far coming out successful.
In Syria, their army was engaged against the Romans in a campaign which culminated in mid-August at the Battle of Yarmouk. With the Christian Empire's war machine broken, Umar was free to dispatch reinforcements to Sa'd's force.
Yeah, though after Yarmouk, it probably wasn't much of a war on two fronts anymore, because Roman resistance, for a time, had basically been crushed.
In the hope of keeping Rostam occupied, the Muslim leader sent repeated embassies to treat with his Persian counterpart, demanding that the Zoroastrians submit to Islam in return for peace. With the Sassanid commander unwilling to convert, and reinforcements streaming into their camp, the Muslims challenged their enemy to battle, arraying their forces in formation and allowing the Sassanids to cross the canal.
I will say, just a little note, it is interesting to think about that the demands of Umar was that the Persians convert from Zoroastrianism to Islam, and they would let them live in peace. Of course, they refused that demand. They're fighting this war. They're not going to give up their religion and their customs. But, of course, fast forward to today, and this entire region is Muslim, Persia, well, Iran, as we'd call it today, is a, predominantly majority Muslim country. I mean, same with, you think about the Byzantine Empire, obviously its heartland is Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. That is also a majority Muslim country. So these empires are sort of fighting to maintain their religions, and, just the fascinating thing, and, what they obviously wouldn't have known at the time is that if you fast forward to the modern day, this whole region is Muslim, It's majority Muslim. Most of the countries in the region are majority Muslim, with only a few exceptions. So, just an interesting thing to think about.
Withdrawing a mile to the rear. With the Al-Atiq Canal bridge occupied by Muslim guards, Rostam's Imperial Army spent the night hours damming the waterway with debris to enable passage. At dawn, Rostam, seated on his throne, ordered his army across, and had the army advance in battle formation against the arrayed Muslim forces. The climactic struggle for Persia was about to begin. The army under the authority of Rostam Farrukhzad was likely made up of, at most, 60,000 Sassanid troops. Even a Sassanid field army at the absolute apex of the empire's power probably would not have been able to muster such massive numbers. And it is even more unlikely that the politically divided, militarily exhausted realm of 628 onwards could bring to bear anything more than 60,000.
I mean, we've seen Sassanid armies throughout this series. They've generally been in the 15 to 25,000 range. And those armies have been defeated, and there's been a lot of upheavals, so I'd think probably less than 60,000 men. We talked about in the last episode how these numbers are usually inflated a lot. With the Romans at Yarmouk, some sources said that they could have had up to 400,000 men, but they definitely had less than 70,000. So we can probably guess that the Sassanids here had a force of less than 60,000 men.
Rostam's bulwark was also a multi-ethnic army, having come together from regions all across the vast expanse of the territory ruled by...
Yep, similar to the Romans. And this is why, of course, this history goes together chronologically, but there's also some similar themes we can see in the Caliphate's war with the Sassanids and the Romans. The Roman and Sassanid empires behave pretty similarly when we talk about their strategy, their tactics, the makeup of their armies, how multi-ethnic they are. They're drawn from across these two massive empires. They're pretty similar in many ways. And of course, they're fighting the same enemy. So some, not all, but some of the conclusions we can draw from looking at the Romans versus the Muslims, we can also apply to the Sassanids versus the Muslims.
By the House of Sassan, from Azerbaijan to Khorasan. It included among its ranks Kurds, Armenians, Turks, Arabic allies, and units from many other peoples.
And not to mention, in the Roman army, we literally have some of those same ethnicities, like Armenians, Arab allies, Turks, some of the same ethnicities, but of course drawn from places within the empire.
Right and left center units of the Imperial Army were under the command of Jalinus and Birzan respectively, and in total comprised 30,000 warriors, 20,000 melee infantry and bowmen in the first line, and 10,000 cavalry in the second. Among these troops were 10,000 professionally trained Persian Immortals, revered elite fighters who chained themselves together as a signal to the enemy that they were prepared to die rather than retreat.
Yeah, and the Immortals had quite a reputation, I'm not that familiar with this era of history, but even I have heard of the Persian Immortals. They were known as fearsome and indestructible warriors. You would definitely not want to come up against them.
Bounded by swampland, which was difficult to traverse, the Sassanid left and right wings were led by Miran and Hormuzan, both illustrious generals drawn from high-born Persian clans.
Wow.
Each led 10,000 infantry in their front rank, backed by 5,000 cavalry behind. In front of Rostam's line was a screen of 33 mail-clad elephants. 18 of them were deployed in the center, while the remainder were split equally on either wing. Rostam himself, donning ornate armor, mounted his raised throne just behind the center, accompanied by a small strategic reserve.
Okay, so it seems like, similar to the Romans at Yarmouk, the Sassanids have really gathered together all of the men they could, put them into this one force. This is to be the army that finally defeats the Muslim invaders. Of course, that went very badly for the Romans, but, let's see how it goes for the Persians.
About a mile to the west, Sa'd's 30,000 warriors drew up in a manner that mirrored their adversaries. 4 tribally organized divisions, with infantry in the first line and cavalry in the second. In addition to the Muslim forces from Arabia proper, Christian Arabs from the border of Sassanid territory, and even some captured Persian officers had joined the army after converting to Islam.
Wow, interesting.
Although Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas was capable of deploying his army properly, ailments and injury prevented him from mounting a horse and exercising effective tactical control.
Yeah, that seems like a big detriment, because we've seen in prior battles, the commander being able to direct particularly Muslim cavalry forces could really be the difference between a loss and a win for the Muslim forces.
Instead, the companion general appointed a trusted deputy, Khalid bin Afuta, to carry out his immediate orders, and took up a strategic position atop the fortress of nearby Uzayb. The various units were commanded by their tribal chieftains, and included men such as Shurabil bin Simt, a veteran of the Ridda Wars and Syrian campaign, who led the Muslim left wing.
All right, I'm interested to see how this army performs, because obviously, it's just been put together. It's kind of a different composition than the other Muslim forces. It's these different tribes. I'm curious to see if they work well together, if it's as effective as other forces, but I guess we're literally about to see that.
As Rostam's large army continued to form up, Muslim soldiers took part in their usual noon prayer, donned their armor, and waited. By the early afternoon hours, the massive Persian army was finally ready to fight. Rostam's plan was simple and to the point: smash both flanks of the enemy army, and then smash into their exposed center.
Alright.
The Battle of Alcadisia began with a heavy barrage of arrows loosed by the Sassanid archers, whose superior bows and higher quality arrows inflicted massive casualties on their lightly armored counterparts.
Damn.
The Muslims attempted to return the favor, but their low-powered bows and inferior arrows resulted in the missiles bouncing harmlessly off the Persian heavy armor.
Yeah, and this brings us back to one of the common themes we've seen throughout the series so far, which is, the different forces facing each other. The Muslim forces, which are generally lighter, they wear lighter armor, they're more mobile, rely more on cavalry, versus the Romans and Sassanids, who have these heavily armored infantry and horsemen. They're much better suited to stand their ground and to fight these pitched battles, where it's just infantry pushing back and forward. Now, at Yarmouk, we saw the Muslims were able to make use of their hit-and-run cavalry tactics to win that battle, even though you would think the Romans would have an advantage. We are seeing that advantage play out here for the Sassanids. With loosing this arrow fire, they can withstand it a lot better than the Muslim forces can. The question is the Muslim side able to use their advantages to maximum effectiveness? That's what happened at the Yarmouk, and that's what's going to happen here for them to win.
The amused Sassanid troops mocked the Muslim archers by repeating the word "spindles, spindles," as the impotent arrows fell harmlessly.
Damn.
With most of the Islamic front line pinned in place by Rostam's lethal storm of arrows, the general ordered a 7-strong elephant corps on his left to lead a charge directly at the Muslims opposing him, followed by the rest of the troops. Frightened by the oncoming Titans, the Rashidun mounts forced their riders to scatter from their position, leaving the infantry exposed.
And we saw this before. One of the best aspects of having war elephants, aside from the combat usefulness, is the intimidation factor. They were intimidating to enemy footmen, and they were also intimidating to enemy horses. And if your horse is not willing to approach this massive beast that it sees, then your cavalry is not going to be very effective.
Beset by Miran's flank and lacking cavalry support, the Muslim warriors fell back slowly, suffering casualties but not breaking under the assault. Saad, witnessing the danger his right flank was in from Uzaib, had 2 units of cavalry from the unengaged center dispatched to reinforce and shore up the line. We
see Saad commanding the cavalry from the back lines, as we saw at Yarmouk, except he's not right there on the field leading personally, which, seems like a disadvantage, but I guess we'll see how effectively he can command from his position.
One of these contingents struck Miran's troops in the front, while the other hit them in the flank, pushing the Persians back to their starting position after a fierce fight. Observing that his attack on the Muslim right was stalling, Rostam completely changed tack. He dispatched part of his immediate reserve under Bahman to keep that part of the Muslim army locked in place, then ordered the Sassanid right and right center to advance, fronted by elephants and covered by another deadly volley of arrows. Again, the vanguard of elephants panicked Rashidun mounts and forced the horsemen to flee for infantry cover. This state of affairs could not continue if victory for Islam was to be attained. Saad.
Yeah, this is looking pretty bad for the Muslim forces right now. This has become sort of a traditional pitched battle, infantry against infantry, and the Sassanids absolutely have an advantage in that style of warfare, and have an advantage in manpower. They have more men. So if it continues like this, I think the Caliphate could be in trouble.
Realizing he had to do something about the Sassanids' assault beasts, had orders conveyed that light troops from the Arabian Bani Tamim tribe deal with them. Darting in and amongst the massive elephants with considerable skill and daring, the agile warriors cut the cables which kept the elephants' mounting platforms atop the animals, and showered the occupants with missile fire. A vast number of the isolated elephant riders were killed where they stood, while the rest led their exhausted war mounts back behind the main Persian line. The general Sassanid attack on this side of the field was also wrestled back. In an attempt to take advantage of his enemy's lack of elephants, Sa'd ordered a general attack all across the front. It is said that while the Sassanids were equipped better than their foe, the Muslims were superior fighters. This level of skill allowed a unit in Sa'd's center to punch through the Persian line and get close to the enthroned Rostam. Descending from his position, the general drew his sword and entered the fray.
Wow, Rostam, not only is he personally leading, he is in there. He is ready to get down and fight. I mean, I do respect that, but it could get him killed, which would be very bad.
Personally, along with some retainers. With the army's morale bolstered by the presence of their leader, the Muslim counterattack was repelled and the front re-established. By nightfall, the last of the day's fighting had come to an end. This first dreadful day, also known as the Day of Disorder by the battered Rashidun warriors, was over.
And, kind of similar to each day we saw in Yarmouk, the, larger empire, the Romans and the Sassanids, started off the day more successful, and then the Muslims managed to make a comeback in the latter half of the day. Though, in this case, it does seem like the Sassanids had quite the advantage and did a number on the Muslim forces.
The wounded were gathered and cared for by women in the Muslim camp and trained surgeons of the Sassanid army, while the remainder rested. When dawn came, both armies once again lined up for battle, facing off until mid-morning. At around noon, 1,000 reinforcements from Syria under Keka bin Amr began streaming onto the field to reinforce the Muslim army, coming 10 at a time so as to give the illusion of vast numbers. This increased the morale of the Muslim army tenfold, and Sa'd immediately ordered another charge all across the line.
Alright.
Despite the heavy casualties that his troops inflicted on the Sassanids, the enemy ranks remained coherent and unbroken, mainly due to the force of their heavily armored cavalry.
I would not expect the Sassanid forces to break too quickly. These are well-trained, well-armored men. They've got strong cavalry and strong leadership. So, it's going to take a lot to break them, but perhaps that is exactly what will happen.
Casualties increased as the fighting grew more and more brutal, but after 2 hours of fruitless fighting, both sides pulled back. The Muslims were trading well, 4 dead Persians for each of their own.
Damn, they must really have been superior fighters then, to have that level of discrepancy. I mean, they're killing a lot of Persians for each Muslim lost. I suppose that's a testament to the skill of their warriors, or perhaps the effectiveness of their cavalry. I'm not really sure.
Trusting in his superior numbers, was content to grind Sa'd's force into the dust. On the Muslim side, Kaka, displaying his energetic and restless nature, used the break-in fighting to cover the camels that the Rashidun army brought with wooden structures, making them look to the untrained eye of a horse like unfamiliar, terrifying beasts. When fighting resumed not long after, the disguised camels were paraded in front of the charging Persian cavalry, spooking the horses into breaking ranks.
I do wonder how much truth there is to this story. I'm not really sure, but taking it at face value, if this is what happened, it's a very intelligent tactic. It's a textbook example of learning from your opponents, but using what you have available to you. Obviously the Muslim cavalry has been disrupted by these elephants several times now. And so the idea to sort of disguise camels in order to play a similar function, they have none of the combat effectiveness of elephants, but if you can give them some of that intimidation factor, then that's a very smart idea. So if it actually did happen, if this is truly what went down, yeah, it's very smart.
Sensing an advantage, Sa'd had the army attack along the entire front again. This time, without elephants or cavalry to bolster their ranks, zealous Muslim warriors scythed into the Persians' units, viciously routing many of them towards the waterway behind, and almost causing the entire Sassanid army to buckle with the shock. However, Rostam's personal intervention and unmoving confidence allowed his shattered contingent to get back into the fight.
Okay, the Muslims are really pushing strongly at this point, but through the personal leadership of Rostam, the Sassanids are staying held together. Now, in terms of his overall leadership, he might want to try something different, because I know he outnumbers the Muslim forces, but, the Sassanids are starting to struggle at this point, but his leadership on the field, his ability to inspire and motivate his men, that seems very effective.
Throughout the evening hours, Persian and Rashidun troops engaged in a slogging match, which, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, managed to painstakingly throw the Muslims into retreat. With that, both exhausted armies retired for the night.
Yeah, once again, a lot of similarities to the Battle of the Yarmouk. This is a large-scale pitched battle, which is fought a lot more cautiously than many of the typical raids, cavalry, hit-and-run tactics used by the Muslims. There's a lot of one-on-one infantry battling, pushing back and forth, battles that are taking several days. Just really quite a slog for all parties involved.
When daylight came on the third day, and the armies were arraying for battle, Sa'd's troops were met with an unwelcome surprise. The enemy ranks parted briefly, and through them marched the mighty elephants, recovered and rearmed, now each surrounded by a protective ring of infantry and cavalry.
Okay, the Sassanids can also learn from their enemies, or learn from their mistakes in this case. They're sending their elephants back out, and they've learned from the other days of battling. Now they've got them protected. This could be bad for the Muslim troops.
When mid-morning came, Rostam had his archers unleash another extended arrow volley, which locked the Muslims in place. As this barrage concluded, the entire Sassanid army, fronted by the terrifying elephants, began inexorably trudging onward. Suddenly, as they approached Sa'd's line, the infantry shielding each elephant's front shifted aside according to plan, enabling the giant war beasts to crash into the Muslim line at close range. The riders were able to escape and fled without delay, but the infantry weren't so lucky. Sa'd's entire army was brutally shoved back, losing hundreds of men who were gored by tusks, crushed by the elephant's feet, or put to the sword by Persian arms.
Damn, just using the elephants is an absolute force of nature, like a battering ram shoving through the Muslim forces, killing those it comes into contact with and pushing everybody back. Very effective, clearly, and the Sassanids have worked out how to work around the elephants while letting them be most effective.
Rostam caught the smell of blood in the water. In order to end the battle, he sent a cavalry division on a deep flanking attack against Uzayb Castle itself, but this was rapidly countered by a unit of Muslim riders. Although that attempt failed, the army of Islam was visibly about to disintegrate, despite the coming of even more reinforcements from the west.
Yeah, it's looking really bad for them at this point. I'm not sure how this battle is going to end. I could see it going either way, but at this very moment, the Sassanids absolutely have the advantage. I could see this battle ending right now, with the Persians just giving a final push and the Muslim army disintegrating, but, as we've seen, this has been a hard-fought battle, so I do think it could go the other way. I'm not quite sure at this point.
Taking advice from a defected Persian soldier at the last possible moment, Rashidun light infantry slid through the ranks, surrounded the 2 lead elephants and blinded them before swarming the creatures and their onboard missile troops. With the elephant alphas killed, other beasts along the line were overwhelmed and killed in the same manner. Many others, driven into a rage by pain and unable to see through mutilated eyes, turned 180 degrees and stampeded towards the canal, crashing through the Persian ranks and disordering Rostam's army.
Oh, and that can be a death blow. A disruption like that can be a death blow to your army. We've seen throughout ancient warfare that elephants can be a massive benefit to your army, but they're also a very dangerous weapon to use because if they turn around or they get confused, they can run right through your army as well. And as I think we're about to see, that can be very disruptive.
Sa'd ordered yet another full-scale assault, impacting upon the Sassanids with devastating force. Alcadisia was devolving into a war of attrition. Not even darkness on the day of hardship brought the fighting to an end. But the soldiers' sheer exhaustion gradually led the troops to disengage at sunrise the next day. Both armies seemed to be at breaking point, but it still wasn't clear who the victor would be.
Yeah, this has been an extremely brutal slog, and to be honest, there may be no victor here. What I mean by that is both sides have lost so many men that despite whoever comes out as the winner, this is kind of a loss for both sides. This has been an extremely destructive battle. Though, of course, it would be far worse for the Sassanids because they're trying to defend their territory. It still wouldn't be great for the Muslims, considering how many men they've lost.
As both armies rested, Kaka decided to make a decisive move. Under the cover of a brief sandstorm, he and 700 troops launched an attack on the blinded Persian center, breaking through the line and approaching Rostam. Isolated and disoriented, the Sassanid general was found by a Rashidun soldier.
Very smart, because every time the Sassanids have been close to breaking, Rostam has come out and encouraged them to keep going. The Muslims have managed to eliminate 2 of the biggest advantages that the Sassanids had. One, their elephants. Those elephants had been turned against the Persians, ran right through them. And the leadership of Rostam. Now, despite his overall battle plan maybe being a little questionable, he probably should have tried something different. His leadership on the field was motivating and inspiring. And to get rid of him, that's, I imagine, going to be very demotivating and perhaps chaotic for the rest of the army.
And slain. Fighting continued until rumors of their commander's fate spread around the Persian army. At that point, the center finally cracked and routed towards the river, followed shortly after by both flanks. The Imperial Army of the Sassanid Empire had been defeated. The Sassanids lost more than 20,000, while the Muslim losses were less than 10,000.
Okay. Still a lot. I'm surprised it wasn't more, but I guess that does make sense with what they were presenting. That's still pretty catastrophic losses for both sides, but like I said earlier, this is of course way worse for the Sassanids, given that, this was their main force put together to defend their empire, and it's just crumbled. So this is very bad news.
Although the Muslims seemingly scored decisive victories against 2 of the strongest empires of the period, the war in the region was hardly over. The next episodes of this series on early Muslim expansion will take us to Egypt, Constantinople, Central Asia, Spain, and France. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button.
Very curious. Well, I'm excited to go to all of those places. Like I said, I will continue to watch this series. That all sounds very fascinating. And of course, even though the Muslims have now scored 2 decisive victories, as they said, they're facing 2 massive empires. They can draw from a lot of resources and a lot of manpower. So it's still not even close to over, but, this video did show, very successful early Muslim expansion. We saw the emergence of Islam, and then very quickly the formation of an empire, which was scoring some pretty impressive W's against its neighbors. So yeah, I'm really curious to see where this goes, how the Muslim conquests continue, because it's something that I really don't know much about. I learned a lot watching this video. I really enjoyed it. If you guys also enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and please stay tuned for the rest of the series, which I will be reacting to. I believe the next one is Early Muslim Expansion, Arab Conquest of Iran and Egypt. Another really long video, 2.5 hours, so that'll be broken up into 5 parts, similar to this one. I'll be breaking it down, and then we'll continue from there. So yeah, I hope to see you guys again next time. Goodbye.